We all know the story. Our banks, again, lending at $40 for every dollar that they had. We end up with this huge bubble economy. All this, remember, the credit equals the housing bubble. The housing bubble creates a whole bunch of jobs. The credit bubble goes away. House prices come back down. We lose the jobs. The Fed president, Ben Bernanke, over the course of the winter, introduces an infinite amount of money into the banking system. That infinite amount of money now amounts to, again, $14 trillion, and at least the promise of more if needed to support the banking system. That was his point back in February. That money, of course, coming either from borrowed money in China, as Jonathan Capehart just referenced, or from our children and our children's children and our children's children. Meanwhile, as we cut these checks, the taxpayers going into not only banks but our states for stimulus money and all the rest of it, we're getting very little systemic change in the nature of our government. You've got this 21st century universe and a 19th century system of government where there's no accountability, no tracking, no transparency. If we can build a table like this for a TV show, my goodness, you'd think we could invest in keeping track of what's going on a federal, state, and municipal level in our government, since that's where we spend so much of our money. It's at 10 a.m., which is basically now. The Oversight Committee at the House having a hearing on tracking stimulus money. We'll see, again, how that goes. The Republicans sent a memo to those committee members jumping on that Biden comment about misreading the economy, so they're looking to use it as leverage. The Government Accountability Office, meanwhile, says that states are using the stimulus money simply to stay afloat, that they're simply filling the hole in lost tax revenue from lost economic activity, a la California, as opposed to being able to use that money to deploy it for long-term projects and all the things that we talked about wanting to use that money for when the check was originally cut. Before we get any deeper into this conversation, I want to bring somebody into it who has to deal with all these things all day, every day, every day, every day for a living, and it's the governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty. Biden spoke to him yesterday, along with a variety of other state governors. We know some of the concerns, anxieties. You just heard me, Governor. Walk me through your sense of the effectiveness up to this point of the stimulus. Let's just isolate on that for a second.
Well, there's a lot of different data points, but here's one that I think will be of interest to you and your viewers. Of the nearly $800 billion stimulus package that was authorized, the General Accounting Office said only about $160 million of it was actually stimulative. In most cases, the states, including Minnesota, haven't deployed or spent most of the stimulus money because we haven't received it yet. And unfortunately, the bulk of the stimulus did not go to bread-and-butter infrastructure projects or immediate tax relief that would put money in people's pockets. It went to, as you just suggested, kind of filling the hole in state and federal budgets.
If you were to look then at the what's your honest assessment, Governor, of the situation your state is in, and then and more broadly, your honest assessment of the situation America is in? In other words, when we look at the debt of this country and the legacy of the credit bubble, and we look at the need to create an economy that generates value, creating jobs, not just jobs that are predicated on a bubble of some kind, whether it's a credit bubble, a housing bubble, a technology bubble, what is your sense of where we stand in terms of dealing with those problems that we're all now really getting a better understanding of?
Well, I don't think we are dealing with it very effectively. In my own view, I think we're going to have the federal government debt crisis equivalent of the mortgage crisis meltdown probably within 15 or 20 years. The spending trajectory that the United States federal government on is irresponsible. It's unsustainable. It can't work. It won't work. It's going to collapse. And so President Obama said in a recent interview that we're out of money. And with all due respect to the president, if we're out of money, we should stop spending it.
I mean, Governor, it feels as if we traded the financial crisis for a funding crisis. We're trading the auto crisis for a funding crisis. We trade Social Security for a funding crisis. We trade health care for a funding crisis. And we simply say, listen, we will provide all of those things either on a state level or on a larger level, but no one has any idea how to pay for any of it. So now the Republican view or a conservative view, appropriately, in my opinion, is stop paying for everything. But then when you do that, I have to start letting banks collapse. I have to let millions of jobs go in the Midwest. I have a lot of folks that aren't having health care. In other words, the just pull the plug argument also can run into a wide variety of problems, which I know you are familiar with.
Yeah, and the consequences of what you described will be worse 10 or 15 years now than trying to deal with it now. What's happening in California, what's happening in New York is a preview of coming attractions for the federal government. And let me also be candid and tell you that states, many states and local units of government aren't immune from this. They've had behaviors and spendings that also are going to have to be reined in. And if everybody else is tightening their belts, families and small businesses across this country, government should do the same.
Craig Jennings, are you there?
I am.
Craig, hi, how are you? Craig is a senior policy analyst at OMB Watch, which basically monitors transparency and accountability, which makes me happy. Craig, nice to see you. One of the other things that has frustrated me about this is as we've written all these checks that Governor Pawlenty is referring to and I've referred to, we have not demanded systemic change in our government to force them to adopt a 21st century model for government that uses modern technology to track, disclose, sort, and deal with the spending of money. And I know they point us to recovery.gov, but I also know recovery.gov is unimpressive to me at this point in terms of how it keeps track of things. How do you feel we're doing in terms of getting any systemic change for our dollars?
Well, I actually think the systemic change is right on. I think what we're seeing now with this spending bill is a radical change in how the government tracks money. This is not to say, however, that the money is totally transparent right now. There are a few issues with it, and I do agree that recovery.gov is actually it's kind of a mess right now in terms of figuring out who's getting what and where the money's going.
And if you look again, what frustrates me, Governor Pawlenty, is having spent 15 years in the world of money and being familiar with what they can do at Boeing, what they can do at Google, what private industry in America and around the world is capable of doing in terms of keeping track and managing systems. It is beyond me why we're not seeing the implementation of some of that technology on our system of government when we know our system of government is irresponsible and wasteful and fraudulent and inefficient.
Well, in fairness to Vice President Biden and the current administration, they're trying, I think, to bring accountability and transparency to it, at least as to the $800 billion stimulus package. And again, for the reasons your guest just cited, I think that's disappointing at this point. But the larger issue is the $800 billion is just the tip of the iceberg. You mentioned earlier $10 trillion or more.
14. It's $14 trillion at the banks.
Yeah.
14.
Then Federal Reserve, monetary policy, FDIC. Where's the transparency and accountability around that money?
There isn't any. It's an outrage. And what makes me nuts, Governor, is that I'm going to watch the Vice President show up and talk about a $155 billion agreement with the hospitals like it's a grand victory, which is, again, $15 billion a year against $600 billion in the business. And then we can't. They won't tell us about the $14 trillion. So either $150 billion is a really big number and we should all gather around and applaud, or it's a really small number and $14 trillion is the big number. In other words, I don't see how they have it both ways. We're ignore the $14 trillion in the corner. We won't talk about that. But, oh, my goodness, we're going to save $15 billion a year. I know I got to let you go, Governor. Do you want to get a last word here before I do that?
Well, just on health care reform, if they model this after the Massachusetts plan and focus just on expanding access to those who are uninsured, that's an incomplete reform. We need to be focused also as heavily, and maybe more heavily, not on just the 10% or so in many states that are uninsured, but the 90% who are insured who can't continue to afford these increases. And the Massachusetts model actually led to higher costs, to a multiple of 2 or 3 what they originally predicted. Yeah. So be careful about a health care reform that talks about just expanding access and doesn't talk about cost containment for the 90% who are insured as the primary objective.
Hear, hear. I could not agree with you more, Governor. I hope to have you back around this particular meeting going forward. Enjoy your day. Thank you, Governor Pawlenty.